Covetousness. Solomon tried to warn and did warn his son about covetousness. Remember back over in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 19? By the way, when the lesson is over today, there are probably about 30 copies of the charts available on the back benches back there, and more I can make as well if need be. But Proverbs chapter 1, look what verse 19 says. He says, "So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain." Solomon wasn't saying that a man shouldn't work in order to earn money for his family. He's talking about those people who are greedy for gain and therefore who will go to means that are not authorized to accomplish the retrieving of these, whatever it is they're coveting after. Look over in chapter 15, verse 27 of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 27. Here the writer says in Proverbs 15:27, "He who is greedy for gain troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live." Covetousness. And someone says, what has that got to do with anything? Well, we'll introduce that a little bit later on in the lesson, but he warns his sons about covetousness. He also warns his sons about lying. Notice with me in chapter 12 of Proverbs. He warns his sons about lying. Proverbs chapter 12, let's start our reading in verse 19, and let's read down through verse 23. Proverbs 12, verse 19. He says, "The truthful lips shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but counselors of peace have joy." He says, "No grave trouble will overtake the righteous, but the wicked shall be filled with evil. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight." He told his sons that lying is wrong, and those who lie are an abomination to the Lord. What about laziness? Turn over with me to Proverbs chapter 10, verse 26. What about laziness? Proverbs chapter 10, verse 26 is an interesting passage. He says, "It is vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes." Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever had vinegar? You got to put the vinegar in your mouth, vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes. He says, "So is the lazy man to those who send him." And then chapter 19, verse 13 of Proverbs. Chapter 19, notice with me there in verse 13. He says, "A foolish son is the ruin of his father, and the contentions of a wife," or his dripping. Verse 15 is what I need to be at, I'm sorry. The contentions of a wife or a continual dripping is what 13 says. We're not talking about wives, are we? We're talking about you. Okay. 15, "Laziness casts one into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger." He also warned his son about sexual immorality. Matter of fact, this is one of the stronger warnings that Solomon gave his sons. And we're not going to read all that he wrote on it. Chapter 7 lays out a scenario of how sexual immorality can destroy a man's life. But I want to go to chapter 5 of the book of Proverbs. Chapter 5, notice with me first beginning in verse 1. He says, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge." Here we go, 5 verse 3. "For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps lay hold of hell, lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable, you do not know them." Now let's jump down to verse 15. He says, "Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth as a loving deer and a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress?" Simply put, the concept of sexuality belongs singularly and only in the marital relationship. Has no business outside the relationship. That's the warning that Solomon gives to his sons. And then lastly of the warnings that we're going to consider at this moment in the lesson that Solomon has given to his sons has to do with the respect for authority. You have to choose not to rebel against authority. Now, this is an interesting passage And initially, someone may ask, how does this relate to the subject of respecting authority? But notice in Proverbs chapter 22, we're going to look at verse 28, real simple, the passage. It says, do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. And then turn over to 23, verse 16. Psalms 23, verse 16. Not 16, we're going to verse 19. Verse 10, I'll read it right. Do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. Now, the ancient landmark, we won't get into a full explanation of it. But landmarks is what were set up to divide land that was owned by people. Whether you're talking about the 12 tribes that were established or even on a much smaller level. But what he's telling them here is do not remove the ancient landmark. Some may be willing to go in and they will take this ancient landmark, we'll move it to another position. But you can take this thought of not removing the ancient landmark into not removing that is which has already been established. And that is therefore to have a respect for that which has already been established. For the authority that has already been established. All right, now this is real quick, and it's not the end of the lesson. But that's some of the warnings Solomon gave to his sons. But what about our youth today? How does any of this relate to our youth? To our young people and the challenges that they go through? Well, the first thing I want you to notice is that young people, you are going to face a lot of bad influences in your life. You will. It's going to come, whether it's from your friends at school or the kids in your neighborhood or the people with whom you work or maybe even the person whom you choose to marry one day. You are going to face bad influences within your life. Now, oftentimes what we have is the draw of the influences has to do with something wonderful, so to speak, of the world. They'll appeal to things of the world to catch your eye, to catch your attention. But I want you to notice what John wrote in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. John writes in 1 John 2, verse 15, he says, do not love the world, neither the things that are in the world. He says, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. He says that for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the world, but is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. Young people and older folks. Oftentimes the influences that would turn us away from God, they are not so obviously horrible, but oftentimes will appeal to aspects of the life. The draw is that love of the world. Whether it be greed, whether it be feelings, whether it be some sort of quote-unquote fun, whether it be trying to fit in with everybody else, therefore you'll feel better about yourself, they're going to try to draw you in. Paul uses the concept of leaven. Now, if you've never cooked, never made bread, you've never had this explained to you, you might not quite understand what a leavening agent is. But if you cook bread, the leavening agent, the yeast there, is what causes the bread to rise. Well, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I want you to notice there with me in verses 6 through 8. The context now, by the way, is the church in Corinth. They had a man there who had taken his father's wife, was committing sexual immorality with his father's wife, and the church there was not doing anything about it. They were patting themselves on the back of sorts for their long suffering, for their tolerance.